Why is it that, as anti-trans hate crimes continue to rise in the UK to terrifying new heights, so many, including Labour MPs, feel the need to defend the source of said violence? Why do they feel the need to go out of their way and accuse trans people of being toxic for having enough self-respect to not lay down and die quietly? These are questions I've been asking myself for years now, and they were recently reignited whilst reading an article about a speech given by the Labour Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, a fact we need to discuss. But first, a quick content warning for the following: anti-Semitism, transphobia, ableism, misogyny, Nazis, genocide, and sexual violence. If you like our work and appreciate the research put into each video, please consider supporting the channel via Patreon. You can also support us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media. I'd also just like to take the time to remind our viewers that the statements made throughout our videos are the opinions of myself, the host, based on the evidence I have available to me. They are not and should not be taken as unquestionable fact, which is why we reference everything, because we're valuable. Thus, we strive to give you, the viewer, the ability to check all evidence for yourself in order to make up your own mind, which is what the reference numbers in the top left corner are for, being numbers that match up with the reference list found in the transcript linked down below. As such, we encourage all viewers to do their own research to reach an informed conclusion about the topic. Hi there, my name is Ethel Thurston, she, her, they, them, and today we're here to talk about how gender-critical fascism earns the title fascism, and why it's so worrying to see Labour MPs defend said ideology as anything but a bigoted belief system bent on the destruction of trans people. We'll also be discussing how this reveals the ugly truth, not merely about the enablement of transphobia in UK society, but also anti-Semitism, ableism, and misogyny, all of which are core tenets of gender-critical fascism. Because whilst this video began as a short piece about one politician in particular, the more I worked on it, the more I came to realise that it demonstrated a much broader problem. That noted, this video did begin as a response to a talk given by the Labour Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, at the Hay Festival towards the end of May, as reported on in the Times, specifically the assertion that, quote, "I think there is absolutely a fair challenge and criticism to say that gender-critical feminists and women who have been raising concerns about women-only spaces or erasure from NHS documents and those sorts of issues were written off as bigots and prejudice and people sort of shut them down." End quote. Streeting would also go on to reiterate his view on the trans community by stating that, quote, "I have never seen an argument for equalities won by shouting down and abusing opponents." End quote. So, a very clear defense of gender-critical ideology, with Streeting promoting the idea that being a member of the gender-critical community doesn't necessarily make one a bigot, and that the trans community have used that accusation to silence debate. So, how do these claims stand up to scrutiny? Well, let's start by defining what the gender-critical ideology entails, before going on to look at the definition of fascism. As someone who has covered the topic for many years, I can tell you that all gender-critical ideology boils down to two core beliefs. 1. That trans women are in fact men, faking their identity as a means to access and terrorize vulnerable women. And 2. That trans men are in fact vulnerable women who have, as part of some insidious conspiracy, been misled into believing that they're men as means to pressure them to undergo chemical and surgical sterilization. These are, generally speaking, the beliefs that unite the gender-critical community. Now, in tying these beliefs to those Labour MP Wes Streeting defended specifically, I'd like to point you towards 3 examples he has attached himself to of his own volition. Those of J.K. Rowling and fellow Labour MP Rosie Duffield, whom Streeting credits for his conversion on the topic, and that of the recent Cass review. With regards to the belief that trans women are in fact men pretending to be women in order to access and assault vulnerable women, we need to look no further than the arguments promoted by J.K. Rowling. She is someone who, in 2018, created public uproar in the LGBT+ community by liking a tweet written and published by Janice Turner that stated, and I do quote, "No fox has a right to live in a hen house, even if he identifies as a hen," on the misogynist thinking which put a rapist in a women's prison. End quote. Yet, as the years moved on and J.K. Rowling stopped hiding her bigotry behind so-called middle-aged moments, she herself would go on to parrot this sentiment in stating that, quote, "Celebs who cozied up to a movement intent on eroding women's hard-won rights can say their apologies for vulnerable women reliant on single-sex spaces." End quote. This is also a concern shared by Labour MP Rosie Duffield, as previously covered on this channel.
That's absolutely great, and I totally agree with that in principle. But if you are a woman who has been abused all of your life and ended up in prison, you may not feel quite that liberal towards someone in a male body who is then allowed onto your wing of the prison. You may have had a lifetime of abuse and rape, which has been done to you by a man in a male body, and when they're just calling themselves a woman, you may feel very differently about being in a hospital ward with them or a prison wing. And I think that those women, it's usually working class women who haven't necessarily had the best start in life or the best experience, that are really worried about this, and the ones that are having to deal with it rather than politicians. And my job is to protect those women that don't have a voice in Parliament like I do.
Focusing on just prisons for a second, this argument ignores the fact that there are already rapists in women's prisons. Not only is sexual abuse rampant among staff at female prisons, a fact people like Duffield and Rowling never seem to care about, but many of the inmates are also sexual predators. Because yes, women can be sexual predators as well. In fact, prior to 2002, whilst women's prisons only accounted for around 6% of the prison population, they accounted for 12% of all sexual assaults that occurred in prison. That number has since equalized with those seen in male prisons, but it's worth mentioning to dispel the myth that cis women cannot be sexual predators. I also have personal experience of just how dangerous it can be to assume that a person is safe because she's a cis woman. As many of you know, both myself and my brother were raped as children inside a women's only domestic violence refuge. This happened under a reportedly safe roof in which we were routinely assessed by a child psychiatrist, at least in part, because said psychiatrist was only concerned about the dangers outside the refuge. So not only does this rhetoric demonize trans people, it also endangers vulnerable people by ignoring half the danger posed to us in day-to-day life. So the issue here is not with rapists being added to women's prisons, because they already are. The issue is with the very idea of trans women being treated as women, irrespective of their crimes or whether they even committed any, which is why Duffield also brings up hospitals, places meant to, help sick people get better. Duffield automatically treats every trans woman as if she were a proven sexual predator, by default, a sentiment Streeting has openly agreed on, with Streeting being so bold as to forward the idea that trans women should be segregated under the separate but equal doctrine that defined racism in the US prior to the civil rights movement.
And it should not be beyond the realms of possibility to have wards for women, wards for men, and also suitable, safe accommodation for trans people too.
So that should be separate. Are you saying that should be, or do you think trans people should be put in wards determined on their sex or their gender?
No, I think the best thing, both to protect the dignity and respect of trans people, and also to maintain the integrity of single-sex spaces, it's to make sure we've got single-sex wards. And I think that would be the right and appropriate way forward.
An argument he made, I must add, years after a Freedom of Information request revealed that out of 102 NHS Foundation trusts, not a single one had received a complaint involving a trans woman. So this notion that trans women have caused any sort of problem in women's hospital wards was already known to be a complete myth, And yet, the Labour Shadow Health Secretary, someone whose job it is to keep up to date with such information and advocate for better health services for all, proactively forwarded segregation as the solution to said non-existent problem, treating sick trans people in need of medical care as inherently criminal, more specifically, sexually violent. Both narratives are, of course, nothing more than an extension of the previous anti-trans panics surrounding bathrooms. And it's worth pointing out that the far-right instigators of said panics openly admit they invented said narrative to deliberately stifle debate, stating, quote, "Now, with the transgender anti-discrimination bills, the same thing is happening. Our side concocted the bathroom safety male predator argument as a way to avoid an uncomfortable battle over LGBT ideology and still fire up people's emotions. It worked in Houston a few years ago. But the LGBT lobby has now figured out how to beat it. Their lopsided victory in Massachusetts will likely be repeated everywhere else unless the establishment pro-family groups and their wealthy donors are willing to change their tactics." End quote. Thing is, not only have the creators of said myth admitted it's all a lie, but we now have peer-reviewed science that, much like the earlier Freedom of Information request regarding hospitals, demonstrates that trans inclusion in women's spaces is not correlated with an increase in any sort of violence, let alone sexual violence. This always was, and remains, a complete myth. Yet it's interesting to see how Streeting accuses the trans community of using charges of bigotry to silence debate, when the far-right instigators of the anti-trans moral panic he is taking part in openly admit that they exploited sexual violence to do just that, to avoid an uncomfortable battle over LGBT ideology and fire up people's emotions. Nothing has changed with the shift from bathrooms to prisons and hospitals. In both cases, Streeting and the people he chooses to associate himself with are exploiting sexual violence suffered by people such as myself to demonize some of the most vulnerable in society. These narratives all feed into the first belief, that trans women are in fact men, faking their identity as a means to access and terrorize vulnerable women. That's why the far right invented said myth. That's why Rowling and Duffield have parroted it, and that's why Streeting has personally responded to it by proposing segregation as the solution, clearly indicating that there's a problem with the presence of trans people to begin with. And now he seeks to lecture us on not responding kindly to him and others who choose to promote such hate speech, inciting violence against the trans community. Because if the regular headlines about trans kids being assaulted and murdered isn't obvious enough, the anti-trans rhetoric Streeting has made himself complicit in has caused an absolute boom in anti-trans violence. We see this in the fact that the number of anti-trans hate incidents between 2012 and 2022 have increased 13-fold. That is an increase of 1,282%. This is a direct result of the argument that trans people, trans women in particular, are violent monsters who need to be handled through some form of violence. Streeting, a politician, forwards state violence as a solution, whilst most of the people he feeds in spreading such hate take on much more direct means. Whichever solution a person proposes, the end result is always the same. Violence targeted at trans people because they're trans. Moving on to the view that trans men are poor, naive girls tricked into thinking that they are trans, we come to the cast review regarding trans adolescent healthcare, what Streeting himself held up as a, quote, watershed moment for the NHS's gender identity services, end quote, and urged that Labour follow what he touted as its, quote, evidence-led recommendations, end quote. Thing is, as someone who has gone over the review, Streeting couldn't be any more wrong if he tried. The two things that define the Cass review, at least to me, are 1. Its open rejection of peer-reviewed science, and 2. Its malicious promotion of known pseudoscience. Starting with its rejection of peer-reviewed science, the Cass review relies heavily on 2 National Institute for Health and Care Excellence reviews, both chaired by Dr. Cass, the same Dr. Cass behind the Cass review, one regarding HRT for trans youth, and one regarding puberty suppression. Now, just focusing on the study regarding puberty suppression, the NICE review relied on the grading of recommendations, assessment, development, and evaluations approach to the appraisal of evidence, also known as grade, to divide the evidence into one of 4 tiers: high, moderate, low, and very low. Now, both the NICE review and the Cass review only sought out the high tier evidence, which includes studies that used randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, double-blind studies in which both the patient and the doctor weren't aware of who was receiving the actual medication and who was receiving a placebo. The NICE review found no high-tier studies under this criteria, which was later used by Dr. Cass as justification for reaching the following conclusion in an interim report. Quote, "Evidence on the appropriate management of children and young people with gender incongruence and dysphoria is inconclusive both nationally and internationally." End quote. There's just one problem. That's not how grade works, a fact laid out explicitly in their guidelines, with them stating, quote, "Although higher quality evidence is more likely to be associated with strong recommendations than lower quality evidence, a particular level of quality does not imply a particular strength of recommendation. Sometimes low or very low quality evidence can lead to a strong recommendation." End quote. They clearly explain how low or very low quality evidence is still evidence and can be used to build a consensus. This is vital in instances where higher quality evidence may not be achievable or appropriate. The creators of the guidelines even go so far as to offer specific medical examples to demonstrate instances in which this has been acceptable. This fact was completely ignored by the NICE review, and by extension Dr. Cass, who concluded that a lack of RCTs and subsequent high-tier evidence was justification to declare said evidence inconclusive, with no genuine explanation as to why the mountain of studies demonstrating the benefits of puberty blockers on adolescent health could be ignored. What's even more shocking, however, is the fact that this argument reveals a fundamental ignorance in Dr. Cass's understanding of RCTs and why they're not achievable, not to mention unethical, in studies regarding puberty blockers. The reason being that the medications themselves are known to work, at least chemically. That's not what these trials are testing. They're testing the psychological impact. This is a problem, since if a child is placed on a placebo, they will begin to see changes in their body as puberty takes place. It is quite literally impossible to hide said effects in order to maintain the placebo. This is why a 2001 study on the psychological impact of puberty blockers in children suffering precocious, early onset puberty quite literally fell apart and had to change its focus. The children receiving a placebo realized they were on a placebo and dropped out of the study to seek said medical care from a different source. You literally can't run a double blind on puberty blockers, not for cis children suffering precocious puberty, not for trans children, a fact Dr. Cass would have known had she done elementary research on the subject. Furthermore, there are ethical questions about the use of RCTs in studies involving children, seeing as said research is quite literally dependent on denying a portion of said children what all available evidence tells us is essential medical care. To put it in analogy form, imagine I wanted to test the viability of parachutes for children. I mean, nobody, as far as I'm aware, has performed clinical RCTs on parachutes, so how can you say they work? So I round up 100 children, give 50 of them parachutes and 50 of them backpacks with some rolled up cloth in it, and chuck them all out of the plane. Naturally, all 50 without the parachute die upon impact, and 48 of those with parachutes landed unharmed, with one breaking their ankle and another dying from a failed opening, because even parachutes aren't 100% effective, just like medications. Would that be ethical, to play with kids' lives that way, just because there's a lack of RCT studies on the matter? Of course not! But it gets even worse when we consider how the CAS review ignores the studies that it does accept. You see, as well as the NICE reviews, the CAS review makes use of a 2024 paper, which the CAS review describes as, quote, an update to the NICE review, end quote, specifically the one relating to puberty blockers. And it's that 2024 paper that divided 50 studies into 3 separate tiers: high, moderate, and low quality. Of the 50 papers, 24 were found to be of low quality and were subsequently dismissed. 25 were found to be of moderate quality, and 1 was found to be of high quality and were thus accepted. So that still leaves us 26 studies to work with, the vast majority of which showed a positive impact via the use of puberty blockers, leading the CAS review to conclude the same. Right? Well, no. Neither the original paper nor Dr. Cass acknowledge the fact that there's still an overwhelming consensus spread across those 26 studies. And in case you're like me and are wondering whether it had anything to do with the single high-quality study mentioned, that perhaps its results completely contradicted everything found in the plethora of moderate and low-quality studies, I'll just read you its conclusion here. Quote, transgender adolescents show poorer psychological well-being before treatment, but show similar or better psychological functioning compared with cisgender peers from the general population after the start of specialized transgender care involving puberty suppression. End quote. Again, this is what both the study and the CAS review accept as a high-quality study, yet its conclusion has just been ignored. This is what Streeting presented as quote-unquote evidence-led, a review that not only flagrantly ignores the majority of available evidence whilst demanding evidence that is quite literally impossible to obtain, but also ignores the evidence its own sources deemed moderate or high quality. And for what? Well, conspiracy and pseudoscience. One thing the CAS review asserts is that growing tolerance and even acceptance of trans people in the early to mid-2010s can't possibly explain the increase in the number of people coming out as trans, as seen in quote, a common explanation put forward is that the increase in presentation is because of greater acceptance. While it certainly seems to be the case that there is much greater acceptance of trans identities, particularly among younger generations, which may account for some of the increase in numbers, the exponential change in referrals over a particularly short 5-year time frame is very much faster than would be expected by normal evolution of acceptance of a minority group. This also does not adequately explain the switch from birth-registered males to birth-registered females, which is unlike trans presentation in any prior historical period. End quote. Reason given? Well, there isn't one. As for what is expected, how does the CAS review quantify that? How does it, when comparing the increase in trans visibility to previous examples, such as gay and lesbian people or even left-handedness, account for the historical advances in the transmission of information? How the internet has sped up the process of community outreach and establishment? Before the digital age, there were noticeable stages of community growth, starting in major cities such as New York and London, think West Village and Soho, which would gradually spread to other cities and then towns. The internet has removed that limitation, allowing communities to form anywhere, even across continents, yet the CAS review ignores this entirely. At least they do, until it suits them, as we'll see later. As for the disparity between trans boys and trans girls, What the Cass review fails to recognise is the very simple fact that the lived experiences of trans boys and girls are not identical. There are two things generally needed for a gender referral as a minor. 1. Knowledge of trans issues regarding the child's gender, and 2. Social tolerance on part of their parents or guardians. Back in 2009, everyone, both parents and children, had less access to the internet, meaning that most of what people knew about trans people came from printed sources like papers or magazines. Thing is, mainstream media doesn't see trans men and trans women as the same. Trans men have historically been erased, their experience completely left out. This has actually led a lot of trans men and trans masc folk experiencing gender dysphoria to misconstrue their dislike of being a girl as the result of patriarchy rather than gender dysphoria. That, of course I hate being a girl, society treats girls like absolute shit. The lack of first-hand accounts by trans men prevented trans boys from realizing that there were nuances that distinguished how they felt from the way cis women feel regarding societal sexism. At the same time, trans women have been demonized, often portrayed as predators and sexual deviants in the paper. Yet, in spite of their demonization, that still meant that knowledge of trans women was more prevalent during this earlier period, even if the overall tolerance was lower, thus limiting the number of trans youth able to receive a gender referral via knowledge rather than tolerance, leading more trans girls to be referred than trans boys. This changed with the advent of the digital age and self-advocacy online. No longer were we reliant on printed media to have our stories heard, and awareness regarding trans people, both men and women, exploded, culminating in the trans tipping point of 2014. This removed knowledge as the primary barrier, replacing it with social tolerance, which again, trans women are less likely to receive due to their history of being demonized, something which continues to this very day. We're discussing an MP for a major British party who has openly defended segregation targeted at trans women, meaning we'd expect trans girls to be less likely to receive a referral than trans boys, and wouldn't you know it, that's exactly what we see. This simple change in what gatekeeps referrals explains both the exponential increase in trans referrals as well as the shift in which assigned gender is more prevalent, and all it took was a little verstehen, an empathetic understanding of trans history that doesn't homogenize our experiences. Though, again, the Cass review fails to consider said simple fact, instead slipping in an alternative explanation during their discussion on gender expression. Quote, research suggests gender expression is likely determined by a variable mix of factors such as biological predisposition, early childhood experiences, sexuality, and expectations of puberty. For some, mental health difficulties are hard to disentangle. The impact of a variety of contemporary societal influences and stressors, including online experiences, remains unclear. Peer influence is also very powerful during adolescence, as are different generational perspectives. End quote. Gotta love how peer influence is just tagged on at the end. Of course, this would set the stage, allowing Dr. Cass to return to the idea, adding in the influence of social media in stating that, quote, peer influence during this stage of life is very powerful. As well as the influence of social media, the review has heard accounts of female students forming intense friendships with other gender questioning or transgender students at schools, and then identifying as trans themselves. End quote. This is what I meant earlier when I complained about Dr. Cass ignoring the internet as a means of transmitting information and forming communities in explaining the exponential growth in trans referrals, but turning to social media to scaremonger about peer influence, which is just a fancy way to say peer pressure. This is a clear bias in thought, with Dr. Cass failing to consider any explanation other than the one that pathologizes trans boys as misled girls being pressured into thinking they're boys. Thing is, all Dr. Cass is talking about here is the fact that many LGBT+ folk still in the closet seek out other LGBT+ folk, forming friendships with and coming out to them before coming out to everyone else. I've actually experienced this very thing. I was mercilessly bullied at school after I was outed as bisexual, and not wanting to have said power stolen from me on induction day for college during the give one fact about yourself, I announced that I was bisexual and told the rest of the class that it wasn't going to be a problem. That day, 2 gay men sought me out and told me that they were gay, one of whom, a gay Nepalese man, had never come out to anyone before and would, over the coming weeks, come out to everyone in college. That's a normal, dare I say, beautiful experience found within the LGBT+ community. So, to see Dr. Cass attempt to pathologize it as something else, something insidious, is fucking disgusting. And this is where things take a turn for the nasty. Because if any of this sounds familiar, that's because what Dr. Cass is forwarding is rapid onset gender dysphoria in all but name, a thoroughly debunked pseudoscientific notion that almost single-handedly destroyed the credibility of the paper it was first published in. Rapid onset gender dysphoria was a hypothesized phenomenon first described by Lisa Littman in her 2018 paper. According to her, there was strong evidence that many trans boys were in fact cis girls, giving into peer pressure, in large part due to social media trends. Her evidence? Well, she asked a bunch of people sourced directly from known anti-trans websites. That's right, she never surveyed the trans youth in question and couldn't even verify that its respondents actually had children that were trans. She sought out hate groups, said hate groups spouted ignorant drivel about impressionable young girls being brainwashed, showing no signs of being trans until they made friends who were, only to then come out, and Littman reported on it as a real scientifically grounded phenomenon. PLOS ONE, the publishing journal behind the paper, received such backlash from the scientific community that it was forced to issue an apology and retract the article. Said article was then rewritten to make it explicitly clear that the study presented no such evidence. The sections edited included the title, abstract, introduction, discussion, and conclusion, so the entire fucking paper, all of which had maliciously misportrayed the data. You can kinda see why Dr. Cass didn't cite it directly. Though I'm not the only one to notice the indirect referencing, with Transgender Trend, a known anti-trans hate group, stating the following in their press release regarding the Cass review. Quote, although no direct reference to rapid onset gender dysphoria, acknowledgement throughout the report that the majority of referrals are teenage girls who develop gender dysphoria at or after puberty, and that this is a completely new cohort. End quote. So I'm not alone in pointing this out. The Cass review seems to be deliberately coy with this idea, refusing to name it, seemingly due to how it immediately revokes the credibility of anyone who forwards it as anything more than a crank conspiracy. You can practically hear Dr. Cass rattle in her chair as she desperately wants to cite Littman's paper, but she can't because she knows it'd be the final stake in the heart of her career. That said, whilst the review refused to cite the now retracted study on rapid onset gender dysphoria, that didn't stop Dr. Cass from citing its disgraced inventor, Lisa Littman, in their section about detransitioners, which is probably as good a time as any to be absolutely clear. These aren't the only issues with the review, they're just the two that really stuck out to me. It'd take multiple hours to sift through everything wrong with the review, hours I don't have the fortitude for. I mean, this video was meant to be a short 20-minute news section, and look how that turned out. The Cass review is insulting on all levels, from the deeply disgusting suggestion that trans people are trans because of sexual trauma, to the pitiable attacks on single-parent households, The cast review does it all. That's how fucking desperate it is. But now that we've debunked both the review's core methodology as well as its conspiratorial thinking, it's time to discuss said conspiratorial thinking in the wider social context, how it not only relies on anti-Semitism and transmisia, but ableism and misogyny as well. Returning to the earlier tweet in which J.K. Rowling demonized trans women as inherently predatory, we also saw her promoting the narrative that young children are being duped into medically transitioning, stating, quote, "Celebs who use their platforms to cheer on the transitioning of minors can save their apologies for traumatized detransitioners," end quote. And while she doesn't mention the gender disparity here, she has done so, as seen in this section taken from her 2022 letter attacking the trans community. Quote, "Most people probably aren't aware, I certainly wasn't until I started researching this issue properly, that 10 years ago, the majority of people wanting to transition to the opposite sex were male. That ratio has now been reversed. The UK has experienced a 4,400% increase in girls being referred for transitioning treatment. Autistic girls are hugely overrepresented in their numbers," end quote. Before going on to reference Littman's already disgraced study. So not only is Rowling forwarding the idea that young girls are being tricked into transitioning, but specifically autistic girls, something the cast review also mentions. Do keep this in mind as it will be important later. As for who people like J.K. Rowling view as responsible, we can take a look at the people she promotes, like in the following section. Quote, "Months later, I compounded my accidental like crime by following Magdalene Burns on Twitter. Magdalene was an immensely brave young feminist and lesbian who was dying of an aggressive brain tumor. I followed her because I wanted to contact her directly, which I succeeded in doing. However, as Magdalene was a great believer in the importance of biological sex and didn't believe lesbians should be called bigots for not dating trans women with penises, dots were joined in the heads of Twitter trans activists and the level of social media abuse increased," end quote. Magdalene Burns was someone who, on top of being incredibly racist and transmisic, openly argued that young girls, i.e. trans boys, were being deliberately targeted and pressured into transitioning as part of an attempt to chemically and surgically sterilize them. Who did she claim was responsible? Well, George Soros and John Stryker were two names she repeatedly brought up, both of whom are well-known Jewish billionaires who are often the target of far-right and neo-Nazi conspiracies. Though the connections don't end there. When gender-critical writer Helen Joyce went on to publish her book, Trans, When Ideology Meets Reality, she lists 3 names of who she believes are responsible for the indoctrination of young girls, namely George Soros, John Stryker, and Jennifer Pritzker, all 3 of whom are Jewish. This is in spite of there being plenty of wealthy non-Jewish folk who also support trans people. The reason they don't get mentioned is because the supporters of rapid onset gender dysphoria believe that it is a Jewish shadow state that is pushing transitioning onto young white girls, getting money in the process before using that money to further their control. It is modern day blood libel. And it needs to be pointed out that Helen Joyce is a close and personal friend of J.K. Rowling, with Rowling not only posing for photographs with the anti-Semitic author, but going so far as to label her as Rowling's quote-unquote battle buddy. That's how supportive of Joyce's work Rowling is. What's more is, these people know what they are doing. They are fully cognizant of their anti-Semitic beliefs. When gender-critical leader Kellie-Jay Keen-Minshull was being criticised for inviting open flag-waving Nazis to her anti-trans hate rallies whilst touring Oceania, she was interviewed on a local radio show by Kim Hill. Pay close attention to what Keen-Minshull tries to insinuate here, as well as her actions, the moment she realises that Kim Hill might be onto her.
When you were asked about the motive of the trans lobby, You said at the extreme end, it's very dangerous people who want access to children and an entire dismantling of society. Do you think that that is not catastrophizing?
Do you not know about the billionaires the billionaire men who are pushing this ideology and funding it? Are you not aware of those people?
No, tell me more.
Are you saying that doesn't happen?
No, tell me more.
You just need to... No, women across New Zealand, they are very, very aware that there are men in women's spaces, men in women's sports, and they are giving carte blanche access to, unfettered access to women's spaces as soon as you say that those men are part of the transgender ideology. As soon as a man basically puts on a dress, he is given unfettered access to women's spaces, including prisons, including rape crisis centres. And I just think it's absolutely preposterous if you don't think women across New Zealand are afraid of that.
Could you please tell me a little more about the billionaires funding the transgender lobby?
Well, yes, you've got Big Pharma, for example. They make a substantial amount of money out of transgenderism. I want to know why it's not important to a journalist to address the fact that there are men in women's spaces.
It's really important as a journalist for me to know more about the billionaires funding the transgender lobby. And since you raised it, I'm interested to know further details. What can you tell me?
Well, I would like to know why, as a journalist, you are prepared to be distracted by that, as opposed to...
But you mentioned it.
Notice how Keen-Minshull throws the conspiracy out there, but the moment she's asked to name names, she realizes that she's fucked up. That if she starts listing Jewish names, Kim Hill is going to point out exactly what she's doing. That's why she's so quick to try and flip the narrative, acting as if Kim Hill is the one who brought the topic up, when no, it was her. If Keen-Minshull didn't realize she was being anti-Semitic, she just named names. So the fact that she clearly has specific people in mind, but refuses to give those names, demonstrates that she knows she's being anti-Semitic here and is afraid of being called out on it. Because Nazis hate being accurately labelled as Nazis. That's why, as papers around the world began reporting on how leaders of the UK gender-critical movement invite flag-waving Nazis to join their hate rallies, J.K. Rowling stepped in to offer Keen-Minshull her vast fortune to sue said papers into silence. Rowling doesn't merely tolerate anti-Semitism in the gender-critical community, she is willing to chuck money at said anti-Semites to actively defend it. That's why it's disturbing to see her attempts to normalize the reptilian conspiracy as something other than an anti-Semitic mouthpiece. Because, let's be clear, people are not calling J.K. Rowling a reptilian, but do you know who is often painted as such? If you guessed people who support trans inclusivity, you'd be right, as seen in this comic by gender-critical icon Tatsuya Ishida. This is just another anti-Semitic dog whistle used in place of the Jews. In light of that fact, it's hard to look at this tweet as anything other than an attempt to muddy the waters. And again, this is someone streeting credits personally for his conversion. Okay, well, sure. The gender-critical movement has an anti-Semitism problem and allies with open fascists, but how does that justify the label fascism? Well, aside from the old saying that if there's a Nazi at the table and 10 other people sitting there talking to him, then you got a table with 11 Nazis, or the more apt, if you're at a rally and someone's there with a Nazi flag and they're not getting the shit beaten out of them, then you're at a Nazi rally. I do so because of the very definition of fascism. Two traits commonly cited as defining features of fascism are authoritarianism and ultranationalism. And whilst it's true that they are important, they are not, in fact, the defining feature of fascism. That would be palingenesis, the idea of national rebirth. Fascists believe that a thriving society becomes the target of undesirable people, often labelled degenerates, who seek to infect society with a form of social decay, their degeneracy, resulting in the collapse of said society. Of course, fascists also argue that the only way to break said degeneracy is to instigate violent ultranationalism, destroying the degenerates, bringing about a new golden age. This is why Mussolini viewed his flavour of Italian fascism to be the successor to the Roman Empire, whilst Hitler viewed the Nazis to be the successor to the German Empire, who were, in turn, the successor to the Holy Roman Empire. That's why the Nazis were the Third Reich, the Third Empire, having its golden age. Now, the targeted social group can differ from fascism to fascism, but regarding the fascism of Nazi Germany, it's Jewish people who face the brunt of it. The Nazis argue that the Jews were poisoning the German way of life, opening its borders to outsiders such as the Romani, extending compassion towards the disabled, and turning the German people gay and transgender, acts that Hitler believed to be responsible for, among other things, the loss of the First World War and the creation of the Weimar Republic. This history is key to understanding how the Nazis, and by extension other fascist groups, operate, how this idea of degeneracy is intimately tied to the notion of national death and rebirth. Another thing to be on the lookout for are common fascist conspiracies, such as the Big Lie, a concept invented by Hitler to describe what he saw as the blatant lies Jewish people pushed onto the German people, with one example Hitler gave being the idea that Germany lost the First World War through its own devices. He argued that, as well as being a blatant lie, it was a lie invented by Jewish people to cover up how they'd deliberately weakened Germany, bringing about the collapse of the German Empire and the rise of the weak Weimar Republic. Another conspiracy is the Great Replacement, which is the belief that Jewish people are reducing white fertility whilst increasing immigration to try and erase white people from Europe, the US, and Oceania. Because fascism in these places is tied to white nationalism in who it believes to be a proper citizen. We also need to be aware of how fascists seek to hijack other political movements, co-opting their language. For example, the Nazis famously labelled themselves nationalist socialist, leaning heavily into the idea that they'd protect German workers. The reality, meanwhile, is that they never had any intention of doing so, and were just using that label to reach a wider audience. Not only did they dissolve the unions, but as Martin Niemöller famously said in his harrowing poem, first they came for the socialists. This is why we can't trust fascists who tell us that they're fascist, and the only reason anyone would argue otherwise is if they're trying to help fascists go undetected. Now, both gender-critical beliefs are an example of narratives based on this concept of degeneracy. With regards to trans women, gender-critical fascists are more than happy to accuse trans women of engaging in the same propaganda techniques Hitler accused Jewish people of using, as heard during this talk organised by Keen-Minshull.
So we need to protect our language forever. Thank you. Well done, that woman. Hello. Language is the thing, and I went to Speaker's Corner almost 2 years ago and was far too scared to speak. And I tell you, I'm not scared now. I'm really ready to talk. Now, I'm going to talk to you about something that I haven't seen in the press. I'm a hypnosis practitioner, and I've been doing hypnosis for 30 years and helping people to hypnotize others. And I know about language. And I know that this is based on something we call the big lie. Do you know the big lie? The big lie was first described by Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf. The big lie is such a big lie that ordinary people like us think, well, that can't be a lie, because I'd never tell any as big a lie as that. We only lie in small ways. The big lie, well, there is one big lie going on, and it was begun by men in the early part of the 20th century. It was began when they had an erotic fantasy, and they decided they were going to sell us the big lie. And what is the big lie? The big lie is trans women are, but they're not, are they? They're men, and we know that. Emotions are what caught them. They got caught not by rational things, they got caught by emotions. And how we're going to break this is by using emotions that shake them out so they can't find that emotion of sympathy ever again. Thank you. Hi. Okay, who's next?
Not one person at this gender-critical rally spoke out in protest. They stood there as a speaker promoted a well-known anti-Semitic conspiracy, this time relating to trans people. Nobody spoke up, not even when she admits the fact that said conspiracy was first described by Hitler in Mein Kampf. In fact, why don't we just play those clips back to back, the part where she introduces the big lie and the praise she receives for doing so.
Do you know the big lie? The big lie was first described by Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf.
Revisionists have attempted to assert that the speaker was referring to Joseph Goebbels' propaganda, but that's not how the Nazis saw it, and it certainly wasn't what Hitler was talking about in Mein Kampf. The big lie was what Hitler accused the Jewish community of promoting, namely the belief that Germany lost the First World War as a result of its own ineptitude. This not only angered Hitler, a war veteran himself, but he personally believed that Jewish people had been the true cause of Germany's downfall. That is what is being called upon here in reference to the trans community, explicit Nazi propaganda from Nazi Germany, and not a single person challenged that. They fucking cheered. As for how to solve the problem of trans degeneracy, well, Keen-Minshull has a solution. The ultra-nationalistic, violent solution.
Had a bit of an idea about some of the things that you can do. And men, for once, I'm talking to you. I'm talking about you dads who maybe carry, I think that's what you say. I'm so down with the American lingo. Maybe you carry, maybe you don't. Maybe you consider yourself a protector of women. Maybe you're that sort of man. Maybe you have a daughter or a mother or a wife. Maybe you have a sister. Maybe you just have some friends. Maybe you just think women are human and you don't need any absolute connection with them to feel compelled to protect us. I think you should start using women's toilets, men, because you have every right to self-identify. Clearly don't do it and upset women and girls that are already in there, but just make a point of doing it and maybe make the women feel okay about you doing it if you come out and you frighten someone. But it's about time that you started using women's toilets and saying that you identify as a woman if stopped. And I think that's how you're going to that's one of the many ways that you are going to have to combat the insanity of self-ID. Even if it's not called self-ID, that's pretty much what you have now in the United States. And that's how you men are going to help. And there's going to be no excuses. And you either care about the women and girls in your life or you don't. But you are going to start inserting yourselves into spaces that are specifically for women and girls. Maybe you're going to do it when you go to your kids' school and they've had to inject this federal nonsense of accepting boys into girls' spaces. Maybe you need to make a point of saying to the head teacher that you're going to go and use the toilet and ask where the girls' toilets are. And you're going to make this really embarrassing for everybody who's going along with it. I'm talking about you dads who maybe carry, I think that's what you say. I'm so down with the American lingo. Maybe you carry, maybe you don't.
Again, science has proven that trans women in bathrooms doesn't make them any less safe. Yet this is Keen-Minshull's response, introducing guns into the equation. Which is to say absolutely nothing of how this rhetoric harms cis women, with many cis women having been targeted and assaulted over the years because their assaulters thought they were trans. Yet again, Keen-Minshull's solution is to introduce firearms. This will limit the expression of cis women, forcing them to dress more traditionally so that they're less likely to be assaulted by a gun-wielding thug whilst using the bathroom. Moving on to trans men, we see the fascism behind this argument in just how obsessed gender-critical leaders, such as Keen-Minshull, who openly used a Nazi Barbie as her icon for years, by the way, are with fertility, framing gender-affirming care as a deliberate attempt to groom and sterilize children, specifically girls, as can be seen in this speech given during her Oceania tour.
Well, what's the alternative? We either stand firm or we let more and more kids get sterilised. We get more and more kids get gaslit at schools. You know, there's no choice. Once you know what's going on, you can't go back to not knowing. You can't unsee the fact that they are gaslighting children and putting women at grave danger. It's just like these kids have no idea what they're supporting. That groomers support trans youth.
A narrative that was openly parroted by literal Sieg-heiling Nazis, like those that turned up to support Keen-Minshull at her hate rally, including Thomas Sowell.
In this country, we have medical professionals performing double mastectomies on teenage girls. And that is a fact. If you are under 18 years of age, you can have your breast removed. But you cannot get a tattoo. You cannot buy cigarettes. But the government allows young girls to have surgery because they think they were born in the wrong gender. That is the sort of society we live in. That is the sort of society that is provided by our own government. And we have medical professionals who are supposed to be our best and brightest, removing the breasts of teenage girls. Whatever happens is in the country. I challenge anybody to justify it to me why it's acceptable for a teenage girl to have surgery and change her gender. This is in 2023. We have drag queen story now. Local councils think it's acceptable for drag queens to tell stories to preschoolers. Why is that acceptable? We all know it's not. We are here to protect the children. We are here to protect the women.
Oh wait, it can't be parroted by said Nazis, seeing as the Cyril speech happened the day before Keen-Minshull said the same crap. So if anyone is parroting anyone here, it's Keen-Minshull parroting Thomas Sowell. This obsession with fertility is a big driver for fascism, since it relates to their Great Replacement conspiracy, the idea that degenerates, i.e. the Jews, are trying to replace white people with foreigners, both by decreasing white fertility and opening a nation's borders, what fascists view to be the destruction of white Western civilization. That is why the Buffalo mass shooter, who was openly terrified of the Great Replacement, included a gender-critical misinfographic who is behind the rise of transgenderism on page 44 of his manifesto. The graphic depicts a number of sensationalist headlines and images regarding the increase in trans youth on the top, a mention of Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sex Research in the middle, don't worry, we will get to him towards the end, and a number of figures along the bottom. Each figure has a blue star David painted on them, with the insinuation here being that Jewish people are responsible for the apparent rise in trans people. Moving on to page 45, we have an article titled Transgender Camp Founder Talks Jewish Summer, with a photo from one such camp depicting several children practicing archery, captioned with the following, quote, "Notice that the camp is disproportionately white, and not only that, but the white people are really white, like Scandinavian-style white," end quote. And it's above this photo, alongside an anti-Semitic caricature of a Jewish person, that we get the how behind said great replacement, with a further caption role-playing as said Jewish caricature, reading quote, "Hehe, yes, white goyim, non-Jewish person. Give your children to me and I'll make them think they're girls. Hehe. Thus they'll all either kill themselves or become genetic dead ends. Oy vey, goyim. It's too easy." End quote. So fascists like the Buffalo shooter see trans people as a way for the apparent Jewish world order to further decrease white fertility, and to make that argument, they single out Jewish people as the cause of transgender youth, with specific attention being paid to said youth's reproductive capabilities. And we see this exact same rhetoric in gender-critical fascism. What was it that Keen-Minshull defended on the Kim Hill show?
When you were asked about the motive of the trans lobby, you said at the extreme end, it's very dangerous people who want access to children and an entire dismantling of society. Do you think that that is not catastrophizing?
Do you not know about the billionaires the billionaire men who are pushing this ideology and funding it? Are you not aware of those people?
No, tell me more.
Are you saying that doesn't happen?
No, tell me more.
Returning to trans boys specifically, and the comments made by Rowling, Joyce, and Dr. Cass, this is done on the assumption that trans boys are not boys, but rather girls, and that to them entails both sexual and reproductive stock, cattle to be controlled. That's why gender-critical leader Alison Bailey, friend of both Rowling and Joyce, once described trans men having double mastectomies in the following terms.
Up and down the country and around the world, girls are removing breasts that have never known a lover's caress.
That's why former members of the gender-critical movement have come out and exposed the facts that many of its leaders target lonely people, literally telling them that if they join the gender-critical movement, they'll be sure to set them up with a partner. An offer also seen in other forms of Nazi fascism in how every soldier will receive a traditional wife. This desire to control the bodies of young people, particularly trans boys, is also why the gender-critical movement have attempted to tether the increase in trans boys to the higher than average prevalence of autism in all trans people and vice versa. The implication being that people with autism are more gullible and thus easy targets for this Jewish world order. This is a connection both the Cass Review and J.K. Rowling have attempted to forge multiple times in Rowling's case. The actual explanation for this is simple. People seeking help for either gender dysphoria or autism spend more time around professionals who are more likely to notice the other trait, meaning that if you're receiving support for one, you're more likely to receive support for the other. This is a common phenomenon in medicine. The argument made here by the gender-critical movement is the same as saying that routine checkups cause diseases because those who receive routine checkups are more likely to catch said diseases. It's complete nonsense. Correlation doesn't equal causation. It also ignores the fact that autistic people are less likely to give in to peer pressure and social trends, a fact demonstrated via peer-reviewed science, with one paper stating that, quote, "The finding that non-binary identities are most elevated seems to support hypotheses focused on autistic resistance to social conditioning, which are consistent with existing evidence of the same effect with respect to self-description of sexual orientation. Perhaps elevated rates of trans identity in autism might result from a rejection of the binary cisgenderist norm, which combined with a below-typical concern for social norms could promote the disclosure of the identity." End quote. Yet, gender-critical fascism uses cultural ableism to further infantilize who they perceive as weak-minded and thus impressionable girls, using said infantilization as justification to strip said trans boys and AFAB MB folk of their basic human rights, including their bodily autonomy. This is also seen in their language. Returning to the Alison Bailey clip, no boys are receiving double mastectomies. Purity blockers, like those prescribed to minors, pause any and all breast tissue growth, and only adults receive gender confirmation surgery. Yet, by referring to trans men as girls, Bailey once again reinforces this infantilization that is then used to strip them of their autonomy. All of which, the infantilizing of AFAB trans folk as easily duped girls, the treatment of said girls as a sexual resource, and the framing of people with autism as vulnerable people who lack autonomy is both misogynistic and ableist. So that's misogyny, ableism, anti-Semitism, and transmisia, all wrapped up in a neat parcel called gender-critical fascism. This is why the claims made by gender-critical fascists to be feminist are so disgusting. This, and the facts that gender-critical leaders, such as Keen-Minshull, have openly urged for the targeting of Gaelic competence, a UK medical standard first introduced to ensure teenage girls to access birth control without parental oversight.
So, I'm particularly unhappy about that ruling. However, there are other routes to win this. So, my idea from now on is that maybe we need to repeal Gaelic, or we need to re-examine. I just think Gaelic is a law that was made for a really good reason. It was to stop pregnancy. So it was to stop quite a catastrophic, massive thing. Bringing another life into the world is not something that should have ever been allowed to be used anywhere else at all. And maybe it was the first step in dividing children from their families. I don't know. I don't know actually if all said and done, whether it's really a good thing. I don't know whose benefit, what other people have benefited from Gaelic, but I'm just not comfortable with it. I think it really has been used badly here. Maybe it was always going to. Maybe that was, maybe, the thin end of the wedge. There's always a thin end of the wedge. There's always an unintended consequence. Maybe this is that we have decided that children really can consent. And I don't think they can. And I think actually we need to find other ways to stop teenage pregnancy.
The narrative that birth control has divided children from their families is a purely fascist narrative. She is signaling to fellow fascists in her audience that she's on their side, she just can't support them so openly. Thing is, all this fear-mongering about fertility and the like are nothing new. Returning to the Nazis of Nazi Germany, one particular man who drew Hitler's ire was Magnus Hirschfeld, a gay Jewish sexologist who founded the Berlin Institute of Sex Research, which offered early forms of hormone replacement therapy and comprehensive sex education. Hitler argued that Hirschfeld and his fellow Jewish conspirators were infecting pure Aryan Germans with the delusion that they were gay or trans, all as part of a ploy to decrease Aryan fertility and weaken the German people as a whole, a narrative that is clearly echoed in both the discussion surrounding rapid onset gender dysphoria and the Cass report. Once the Nazis had risen to power, they raided the Institute and seized its research, which was then destroyed in early book burnings, providing the bulk of what was destroyed. The Nazis then rounded up the Institute's members, both gay and trans, forcing them into concentration camps under the Pink Triangle. The narratives that Wes Streeting has promoted are not merely fascist, they were part and parcel of the justification given by Hitler for the Holocaust, both in the destruction of the Jewish people and Germany's LGBT+ community. Historical facts which, recently, J.K. Rowling has gone on to deny, actively engaging in Holocaust denialism. This is what Wes Streeting is defending when he claims that a toxic trans community has used accusations of bigotry to silence debate. It seems Streeting fancies himself more of an Ernst Röhm than a Magnus Hirschfeld, to which my advice would be for him to read up on what happened to Röhm during the Night of the Long Knives. Once trans people are out of the way, gay men, such as himself, will not be spared. Sadly, if gender-critical fascism continues on its current course, I don't know if any trans person will be left to tell him that they told him so. The trans community already hears jackboots marching down our streets, regardless of who wins the next election. And you know what? Events this last week have completely vindicated me on that. Not only did we see Labour candidate Faiza Shaheen, a woman of colour, blocked from running in her local constituency due to liking a comedy sketch making fun of the US government's unconditional support for Israel's atrocities back in 2014, but Keir Starmer has come out swinging, declaring plans to slash immigration and take back control of British borders. This, after years of suffering inflicted upon the British people by Brexit, a move proposed on grounds that it'd slash immigration and allow us to take back control of our borders. Of course, if we're not in control of our borders, the question then becomes, well, who is in control? Which is where fascism and the Great Replacement conspiracy really thrive. That's the hate Keir Starmer and his party have chosen to feed. Labour is dead. It has become just another xenophobic, anti-Semitic, racist, ableist, misogynist, transmissive institution riddled with fascists, which again, nobody is doing anything about, effectively making the entire party fascist at this point. I am genuinely terrified about what the next 10 years will bring, because how could I not be thinking about these things when MPs from both parties, as well as government reports, are parroting anti-Semitic conspiracies whilst openly advocating for segregation. These next few years are going to be decisive in deciding the sort of nation the UK becomes, and that is terrifying. Though what do you think? Can Labour be salvaged at this point? And if so, what would you like to see them do to bring that about? Can you think of any ways that we can inform your average British citizen about the fascist roots of gender-critical ideology? What things stick out to you regarding the cast review? Did you notice something I missed? If so, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. And if you appreciate what we do here and want to help out, please consider becoming one of our wonderful patrons who make our work possible. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Hannah Banghart, Gert Van Vorst, Goddess Alita, Marble Wings, Sosh Daniels, Flynn, Higgins the Seagull, and Ocean on a Teaspoon. And from myself, Edita and Levi, take care now.